Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. So this paper is about information asymmetry, externalities, and qualities of exports. So the question is, what do you think about goods with the label made in China? So a lot of people associate made in China with like low quality products. So in other words, to say quality risks are very high when you're sourcing from developing countries, especially China. So here is a current example. So during the COVID-19 crisis, we saw a bunch of news say there's a few Chinese exporters, they're exporting 40 testing kits, all these false masks to European countries. And because of that, it is reported that the accuracy rate of these Chinese test kits is relatively low. So during due to all these news reports, some countries they are opted to source from South Korea instead of China when they can. So this is a very good example of the externality I'm going to talk about here. That is, there exists a few low quality exporters, say who are exporting substandard products, and these kind of products give consumers or buyers bad prior perception on the quality from that market, like China. And then consumers or buyers will hesitate to source high quality products from Chinese market when quality is critical. And in China, we do have capable ones who can provide high quality products. And because buyers hesitate and less willing to source high quality, this kind of reputation effect would limit quality provisions by capable ones in these Chinese markets. So this is the externality, negative externality I'm going to talk about in this paper. So I'm going to look at the trade under the following institution background. So first, there is information asymmetric between buyers and sellers. So buyers can perfectly observe quality until they receive the goods. Well, another problem is weak contract enforcement. So quality is very hard to perfectly contract. Then that leads to moral hazard problem. This problem is more severe in developing country because they have weak legal system. So if there is moral hazard problem like the exporters breach the contract, then the importers will have very high lawsuit costs to punish these exporters. Well, if moral hazard is the only problem, is the only information problem, then the buyers can design a contract, design a self-enforceable contract to these exporters. However, if the buyer, that's usually the case in reality, if the buyer have very limited information on supplier's cost function or efficiency type, then the buyer will have hard time to design a proper self-enforceable contract. So this is the adverse selection, which is another type of information asymmetry happening in the reality. And this is more so for China, especially from the period 2002 to 2010. Because China just joined the WTO and China is new to the international market. There's a lot of unknown Chinese firms. So in this paper, the specific research question I'm going to ask is, does information asymmetry limit exports from developing country? And what are the policy implications from that? So first, I'm going to talk about the reduced form evidence. So I'm going to use a policy change as a natural experiment. So I will be more specific on this design. And then I will have a structural model which help to explain the evidence, help explain the reduced form evidence and by estimating the model, then I can do the counterfactual analysis. So in the counterfactual analysis, I will show a very counterintuitive result. That is, under the information asymmetry, a reduction in export subsidies or raising the export barriers actually will help these exporters, will help the export performance. So I want to mention, so the paper is related to a few papers, but I want to especially mention the paper by Jie Bai and other co-authors. So they studied the effect of 2008 Chinese milk scandal. How does this scandal affect Chinese exporters? So what they found is exactly the negative externality. So they found that after the scandal, not only these contaminated firms, but also non-contaminated firms experienced a worse export performance. So this is the externalities through the collective reputation. International buyers are less likely to buy milk from China because of the bad reputation. So now due to the time limits, I'm going to skip other papers. So let's look at the empirical now. So in this paper, I'm going to use the Chinese customs data. So I'm going to focus the export data, the exports to the EU and European and North American markets. So I'm going to focus on the private exporters only because they are much, much smaller and they have a huge number, but most of them are unknown to foreign buyers. And I'm going to look at the industry of electrical and electronic equipment because that's the policy change are. So let me show you one statistic. So if you look at the Chinese exports data, you will find in terms of number of exports in the electrical and electronic industry, FDI and private firms is roughly half and half. However, in terms of the size, the sales, FDI would dominate. So basically say, for the private firms, there's a lot of small private firms existing in this market. And these firms are very small, so they are more likely to suffer from the information asymmetry. So they have no brands, they are unknown to many foreign buyers. So that's why we're focusing on this sample. So first, let me show you.
Sorry, quick one, just to clarify. So we're going to focus on 4% of sales of, or is that?
Yes, we are going to focus on the 4% or 6% private firms, domestic private firms, but they have a huge number. So let me first show you the first evidence. So which is purely data pattern. So that is the pattern, that is the, here, this is the tenure, which is the age in the market. So I'm regressing the unit price of an export on the tenure, which is the age in this market. So after controlling the firm product destination fixed effect and other like product level or firm level time varying controls. And what the first show is that the price is going up when the firms are older or have more exporting experience. Now, this is not a very strong evidence for information problem. So that's why I'm going to use a policy change to identify my story. So the policy change I'm going to look at is the ROHS, the restriction of hazardous substance directory implemented by the European market. And it targets the electrical and electronic equipment. It took effect in 2006 in July. So what does it do? It says after 2006 July, if you want to export to the European market, then all the manufacturers, including exporters, they have to limit the hazardous substance such as mercury, such as lead in their products to a very low limits. So So basically, it raised the entry cost because firms need to do R&D. They need to do the research and development. They need to find the new supplier who can supply the goods that is compliant with this regulation. So there's a lot of like upfront costs to be able to export to the European market. Well, there a lot of inefficient exporters or small exporters, they cannot afford such R&D expenditure, so they choose to stay out of the EU market. They are kicked out of the EU market by this regulation. So I want to study the before and after the regulation. So what I found here is that the blue line is the before regulation. Is the period before the regulation, which is from 2002 to 2006. So you see that the tenure, the price slope, is upward. And after the regulation from 2007 to 2011, the price tenure flattens. Now, let's compare to the North American market, looking at the same ROH product, where this market do not have this regulation. So in this market, the price slope almost stayed the same before and after the regulation. So I think this is a quite good evidence to identify my story. Why? So think about a potential explanation why this price is going up along the tenure. Well, there are a lot of explanations, but my explanation, one of the possible explanation is that the age contains the information of exporters. So if the exporter can be survived in the market for a long time, he's an experienced exporter, then it shows that this exporter is very profitable and it is a high quality exporters. Otherwise, at the beginning, over time, it will be kicked out of the market due to the low profits. So if you are in the market for a long time, then from the buyer side, the experience is much easier to observe by the importers. So on the buyer side, importers are more likely to source high quality goods from these experienced exporters. So my point is the age or the tenure contain information of the exporter's quality. That is why we saw an upward sloping tenure slope. Now, this policy kind of kick out these low quality exports at the beginning, which means after the policy period 2007 to 2011, then in the market, the pool of exporters become more homogeneous. So the bad ones already be kicked out of the market, only the good ones are left in the market. So the tenure will contain less information of the exporter's quality. That is why the tenure slope flattens. And in that market, in the North American market, because there's no kind of policy exists, so we still see this upward sloping tenure. Now there is
Yingyan, I have a quick question. So feel free to postpone, but I mean, I had two questions. The first one is, so I guess you should see a level following the policy in the EU market. You should see a level increase in the price if the story is that you select out all the bad ones. So I was wondering whether, I guess those graphs are normalized. I was wondering whether you saw that in the data as well.
Yes.
And the second question was, I guess yesterday we saw a paper that said that prices were kind of flat with tenure and with entry into export markets, conditional on productivity. So I was just wondering how to reconcile your findings with these other findings.
So in terms of the first one, in the paper, I do looking at other evidence like the level increases, and the second is the variance of the price decreases after the policy, which means firms are more homogeneous. So we do find these evidence. Now, in terms of the second question, well, I think I need to look at the paper more carefully before I respond. Thank you.
Can I ask a question as well?
Yes.
Related to this. I mean, I guess there are many possible stories for what you just showed us. I mean, it could be that there is some sort of learning by exporting, or I guess it could be also a reputation story. I mean, do you take a stand on what is actually driving this?
So if it's learning by exporting, so here I'm not excluding other possible explanations. So I just say the information story is one potential explanation. So that's why I'm looking at the change in the tenure slope. So I'm kind of assuming that before and after the learning process are kind of the same. That is why we saw there is a common trend in the North American market, both upward and sloping. But the learning story may not be a good explanation why the slope change after the policy. So now this is like a difference in difference, and I'm comparing to the ROHS product, which is the electrical and electronic products, to the non-ROHS product. So these products are not targeted by the regulation. And we saw that the tenure slope kind of remains the same across different markets before and after the regulation period. And more interestingly, when I compare the ROHS product of private firms to the foreign firms, to these FDI, foreign exporters in China, you see that for this FDI, their tenure, their price slope kind of remains the same, even though there is a small change, but the magnitude is much, much smaller than these private firms. So the other group is like the third difference. So this is the triple difference comparison. Now after establishing these empirical results, then I try to have a structural model incorporating heterogeneous exporters in their efficiency of producing quality, and also including information asymmetry on quality and a moral hazard. So for the importers, the efficiency type or the cost structure of exporters is unobservable to these importers. So it's hard for importers to design a self-enforceable contract. And in this presentation, I'm going to present a simplified version, and I will use a full model for the estimation. So in the simplified model, let's think about T, the little t, as the year, like year, and a big T is for the tenure, like the age in the market. And there is a fixed potential measure of potential entrants, exporters, which is M, T in each year. Now the cost structure of exporters look like this. They have quality, so the unit cost of exporter is a function of quality Q and their efficiency levels theta. The more efficient exporters, they can produce goods at a lower cost. So they can produce high quality goods at a lower cost. In the simplified model, let's think about a two-type model. So there are only two types of exporters in the market. One is the low type, one is the high type. So for the high type exporters, they have a lower unit cost to produce quality. Now, I want to simplify the demand side. That is, for each period, each exporter will meet one unit measure of new importers, and each importer will demand 1 unit of the goods from the exporter. So in the simplified model, I just want to simplify the demand side, and the importer and exporters engage in repeated purchase. So importers have the full bargaining power. They are going to make a take it or leave it offer, which is P and a Q. So P is the price and the Q is the quality level they demanded from the exporter. So the importers will say, I will repurchase again if the contracted quality Q is produced. Otherwise, the importers are going to terminate immediately. So this is like this is like the most severe punishment. Like I will terminate the relationship immediately. So that's kind of a way to enforce the contract. Now, to simplify the contract term, I'm going to look at a fixed contract. That is, once the relationship is formed, then the contract term is fixed during the relationship. They're not going to change the price or quality. Now, the efficiency information here is that one is the quality Q is not contractable. It relies on the self-enforcement contract. And another thing is the importers do not know theta, do not know the efficiency type of these exporters. Importers can only observe tenure, which is the experience of the exporter, the age of the exporter. So the importers are going to, within each new relationship, the importers are going to offer a contract, P and Q. Since the importer can only observe tenure T, so they are going to conditional on T. The contract is going to conditional on T, which is the tenure. So additionally, there is some exogenous breakup rate. Now, in each year, if the exporter wants to be in the exporting market, they are going to pay a market access cost, which is F. It follows from random log normal distribution for each period. Let me summarize everything here in the timeline. So at the beginning of the time, the exporters will have the state like the efficiency level, the age, as well as a stock of contracts. And then they are in the market deciding whether to pay the market access cost F or not. So if they pay the cost, then they are going to enter the market and meeting the importers. So once they meet an importer, the importer is going to offer them a contract, P and Q, and the exporters are going to decide whether they are going to honor the contract or breach it. So if they breach, the importer are going to terminate the contract. If they honor, then the importer is going to continue the relationship. So if they are going to continue the relationship, then the stock of contract is going to be updated. So this is the main problem of exporter is whether they are going to stay or exit at this period. Given the exporter's problem, then we can derive the distribution of exporter in the market. And given the distribution of exporter, then the importers are going to design a contract to maximize their expected utility. I will be more specific on the importer problem later. So this is the importer's question. Like for the importer, they have a per period utility. That is a quasi-linear form. It is increasing in quality Q and decreasing in price. So the importers is trying to design a contract P and a Q in order to maximize its expected utility. So I is the type. I is the exporter's type, whether it's high quality, or it's low quality. And if given the contract, if the exporter chooses to honor it, then the importer is going to get a positive utility. If not, if the exporter breach the contract, then the importer is going to pay the price, but basically he's going to get zero utility, zero quality. So that's the case where the exporter breached the contract. And H is the distribution of exporters in the market. So the share of high type and the low type. So given the exporter problem, given the importer's problem, we will have the equilibrium of the model. That is, given importer's contract, exporter make their optimal decision, and a given exporter's decision deriving the distribution, then importers maximize their expected utility, deriving the optimal contracts. So let's think about the importer's contract more clearly. Think about the importer met an exporter with the tenure T. And for this cohort in the market, there is a fraction of high-type exporters in the market. Then the importer's optimization problem would be they're going to choose between two cases. That is, they can design a contract such that no exporters will default. So basically say both high type and low type exporters are going to honor that contract. Or they can design a contract such that only the high type exporters have the incentive to honor that contract. So in this case, in case 2, then the contract is only incentive compatible with the high type. So if if the importer met low type exporters, they're going to get default. So this is the importer's problem. So let me draw the importer's expected payoff functions in the following graph. So given a very low lambda h, which is the fraction of high-type exporters in the market. So given a very low fraction of exporters in the market, what is the expected payoff for the importers? We draw the expected payoff for these two cases separately. So if the importer choose the case 1, that is no one defaults, then the red one is the expected payoff for the importers along P. So he can choose a different price, and then this price will be the optimal contract. Now, if the importer choose case 2, that is, they are going to choose the contract that's only the high exporter is incentive compatible, then they are going to get the blue line along P. So the red one would dominate the blue one. Then in this case, the importers is going to choose the optimal price P and choose case 1. That is, they are going to design the contract such that no exporters is going to default. And red one dominates the blue one is intuitive because here the lambda h is quite small. So in the market, there's very few high type exporters. Now, when the lambda h increases, that is when the market have a lot of more and more high type exporters, then the case 2 would give the importers higher expected payoff. And importers are going to offer a higher optimal price and quality. So they're going to design, the importers is going to design a contract that is such that the high type exporters going to honor the contract, but they just neglect the low type ones. So when the h goes to 1, that is, in the market, there's only high type exporters in the market, then of course the importers are going to choose case 2. That is, the importers are not going to concern about low type exporters. So from these two graphs, we will have two important implications. One is the lower price and the lower quality will be offered when when more inefficient exporters are in the market. So that is this one. And the second one is the quality and the price are going to increase with tenure, with the age. Why? Because we have this random market access cost. So at the beginning, there is inefficient one in the market, but over time it will be kicked out by the market access cost. So these inefficient exporters, low-type exporters, may not be able to, they are more likely to get a negative shock and be kicked out of the market. So quality and the price will increase with the tenure because over time, the pool of exporters are going to become more efficient. So now let's think about, suppose other than these two implications, suppose there is an increase in the entry cost, what would happen? An increase in the entry cost, it's like the entry barrier increases. So what would happen? If there is an increase in the entry cost, basically say at the beginning, for the new exporters, these low type exporters will completely stay out of the exporting market because they cannot afford this entry barrier. So with a higher entry cost, you will get a better pool at the beginning. So the importers, for these new exporters, the importers are going to offer a higher price comparing to a low entry cost. So with a higher entry cost, probably the starting price is from here, which is P prime double star. And with a low entry cost, then the start point will be here. So over time, approaching the limits, they're going to convert to a similar price, but the starting point is higher than before, so the slope of price will be flatter. So this is the third implication of this paper. So the price tenure slope will flatten when entry cost rises. That is, there is a more efficient pool of exporters at the beginning. So this is the three important implications in this model. We are going to have a full model for the estimation. So in the full model, we are going to, instead of two types of exporters, we're going to have a continuous type of exporters following a log normal distribution. And in addition, I'm going to capture the slope. That is, there is some exogenous process of productivity growing over time. And importers, instead of only observing tenure, they're also going to observe a signal of the efficiency type. So the signal will be unbiased, but it has some noise. So the importers observe something, but it's not perfect. So the importers, instead of only conditional on T, the contracts offered by the importers will be conditional on tenure T as well as the signal. Now, the key estimation here is that the key identification here is that, well, we are going to use the pre-regulation period to estimate this exogenous tenure slope, but we are going to use the change of tenure slope before and after the regulation to identify this sigma. So think about if this sigma s, the variance of the signal is small, it's almost zero, which means the importer can perfectly observe theta, can perfectly observe the type of the exporter. Then the importer, even though there is moral hazard problem, but importer can design a contract that is self-enforceable to the exporter they met. However, if the sigma s is extremely large, then basically say the importers can only know tenure. They know nothing about these exporters. There's huge information asymmetry. Then the importers cannot easily design a contract enforcement, cannot design a self-enforcement contract. So in that case, if there is a lot of information asymmetry, importer do not know nothing about the exporter, then the regulation which kick out of these bad exporters will be meaningful for the importers, the pool, the shift, the composition of the pool change before and after the regulation is meaningful for the importers. So after the regulation, the importers basically say, well, now the exporter on average is better, the pool is more homogeneous, then the tenure provides me less information. So this is the idea, like using the regulation to identify, using the tenure slope change to identify this sigma s. So here is the estimates from the simulated moments, method of moments, and the table reported estimates and a credible interval from the MCMC estimator. So after estimating the model, then I'm going to do a counterfactual analysis. So here I did a very simple counterfactual analysis. That is, suppose at the beginning, for these new exporters, they're facing a higher entry cost. What would happen? So an increase in the entry cost mimics a reduction in the export subsidies provided by Chinese government, or you can think about like the Chinese government require a stricter certification. So this is, so before entering the market, exporters have to pay additional entry cost, a higher entry cost. So what would that happen? Now, here, the entry cost follows some log normal distribution. Let's fix the variance of this entry cost, just increasing the level. What we have is, it is true that there's fewer firms are going to enter the market. So the entry rate by exporters is going to decrease. So there's more firms are kicked out of the market. However, if you look at the price, it's going to increase because these bad, inefficient exporters are kicked out of the market by this entry cost. So importers are more willing to offer a higher price. Now, if you look at the overall profits or total sales, you will see a hump shape. So at the beginning, the total profits, even though there are fewer firms in the market, but the net profits is going to increase. Well, in the end, there will be a turning point because there's too few firms in the market, so the net profits will going down. But at the beginning, it's going up. It's indicating that at the beginning, at least at the beginning, increasing the entry cost or restricting the exporting entry will be benefiting. So this is the main conclusion from this paper. That is, we studied the impact of information asymmetry in international trade, and we provided some empirical strategy, and there is an anticipated policy implication. That is, with the information asymmetry, with the negative externality, actually some entry cost actually will help the export performance.
Okay, very cool. All right, Dorian is next. So if you unshare your screen, Yingyan, then Dorian can share hers.
Yes. Okay. No. How can I stop it?
I can do it for you. There we
go.
Okay, good. And then Dorian, you should have a button at the bottom of your screen. Perfect. Okay, go ahead.
So thanks a lot for the invitation to discuss this paper. It was very interesting. So I'm going to give, given the short time, some pretty high-level comments and not get into the details. Whoops. Okay, so in terms of context, you know, we talk a lot about tariffs, but there's been some recent research suggesting that information frictions may play a particularly important role in impeding trade for developing countries. So these are two papers that were cited in the literature review, the paper by Starts and the paper by Bai et al. So these are papers more from sort of a development perspective. And so the question arises as to what kind of policies might help overcome these information frictions and potentially allow these reduce frictions and allow for these countries to trade more. And this paper suggests that, you know, the higher fixed cost of exporting might be welfare improving, which seems like a pretty counterintuitive result. So that's super interesting. So let me just sort of explain the main idea of the paper as I understand it. So producing quality is costly. And I, as a buyer, can't perfectly observe the quality of a good that I'm buying before a purchase is made. So there's some form of asymmetric information. And in the presence of this asymmetric information, some firms may choose to cheat by selling low quality goods. As I said, producing quality is costly. So they may pretend to be high quality sellers. And so this sort of asymmetric information gives them the chance to engage in this cheating. So this is sort of the moral hazard part of the story. Now, the presence of these cheaters in the market, I don't know who they are, but I know they're there, makes me reluctant to pay a high price for a good. And since I'm reluctant to pay a high price for a good, then there's a disincentive for the good firms, for whom quality is also costly to produce, to sell high quality. So this is sort of the externality part of the story. And then the intuition for the counterintuitive result is that, you know, a fixed cost, if you increase that, that's going to kick out the bad firms, the sort of the low productivity firms for whom producing quality is the most costly. And that, you know, will give buyers the confidence that there are only good firms in the market. They will be prepared to pay high prices, and the good firms that remain in the market may do better. So as I understand it, that's sort of the main idea. And then the contribution of the paper is to develop a formal model with these features, with asymmetric information and moral hazard, and to estimate this model using export data from China, where identification in this case is going to rely on a policy shock that makes it more expensive for firms to sell particular products to the EU because it restricts the use of hazardous materials. In the context of the model, this will this is assumed to act like a fixed cost and to therefore sort of perform the role of selection. So then by looking at selection before and selection after the experiment, one can get an idea of how to identify key parameters. And then once the model is estimated, the counterfactuals are export subsidies and this particular example of higher fixed costs. So that's the contribution of the paper. I just had sort of one or two high-level comments that I wanted to make. This, you know, seems super interesting, but there is the issue of, you know, there might be some alternative hypotheses for this key price survival gradient, which is identifying the model, which is playing a really important role in identifying the model. So I have some suggestions for how to think about ways in which this price survival gradient could be shown to be really related to the mechanism of the model. So, you know, one thing to think about is, you know, just across different types of goods in these data, is the price survival gradient steeper for goods whose quality is less easily observable? So that's something that you would be able to look at. So I don't know, for example, my toaster just broke. A toaster is the kind of good, it looks great, you know, it's shiny, it has all the features, it looks fantastic, but there's some loose connection in there such that, you know, I keep pressing the button that says toast, and nothing toasts. It doesn't switch on. It's hard for me to observe the quality of this good, and it's hard for the buyers to observe the quality of this good without really sort of testing it. But there may be some other goods where it's just really obvious what the quality is. I don't have to wait for it to break in order to find out is it good or not. So maybe by comparing price survival gradients within these data across different types of goods with these features, you could provide more evidence for the exact mechanism of the model. Another sort of potential dimension of heterogeneity is that there might be market mechanisms that could arise to deal with the information friction. And I can't think of any off the top of my head, but is the gradient steeper for goods where these mechanisms, market-based rather than policy-based, are less likely to work? One other thing, which I guess the Chinese data is not going to be able to answer, but I think is sort of in terms of the big picture really interesting, is this issue more salient for developing countries than for developed countries? So maybe developing countries have a higher cost of producing quality, or maybe they produce goods for which quality is less observable. And as you mentioned, there may be contracting frictions. So, another sort of question is the price survival gradient steeper for developing countries for the same good than it is for developed countries? And that might be sort of another way to get at really what is the main mechanism of the model. But bottom line, I think this is a contribution to a really interesting literature on non-policy trade barriers and non-policy sort of trade costs more broadly, that I think is super interesting, and I really enjoyed reading it. So thank you.
Okay, great. Yingyan, you want to take a few minutes to respond, and then we'll open up the floor to discussion?
Yeah. So in terms of the market mechanism, so that's actually in my future research agenda, is about FDI. So the most direct way to tackle this information problem is probably by half the ownership. So that's why we saw that in this electrical and electronic markets, actually most of them are exported in terms of sales, are mostly exported by foreign firms, which is either the wholly owned by foreign firms or partially owned by foreign firms. So maybe in the future, I should have kind of designed a clear way to identify, well, maybe there is a reason. So what explains the foreign ownership? Maybe information problem or quality control is one possible reason. So in terms of the product heterogeneity, I think that's really interesting. So like some goods, maybe it's experienced goods, or some goods are harder to detect the quality. I think that's a quite interesting point. But I think I need to find some like standard category to say, well, these kind of goods are more like the quality are more easily to be detected, but others are hard to detect. I think that's a very interesting direction to study. But it's true that it's very hard to study across countries, because different countries will have different like institutions, and they will have different learning process, or it's hard to get cross-country export customs data, detailed customs data like China. So yeah, cross-country studies may be a little bit harder here. Thank you very much for your comments. These are really important for me to think about, especially for future research. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So take some time now to open up the floor to questions or comments if anybody has them.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I had two comments to also the points that Doreen raised. So one of them was about the market mechanism. So of course, with quite a bit of research on different payment terms in international trade, and of course in your model you assume, as far as I could see, that everything's paid in advance, and so that kind of exacerbates the problem, because of course we know that about 80% are open accounts. So in some sense, quantitatively, that will probably take that mechanism a little bit down. But that would be kind of, and of course with letters of credit as well. So there are market mechanisms besides ownership that would work there, and I think would be useful to discuss that. and how that would affect it quantitatively. Also on product heterogeneity, so I have a paper a few years back where we looked at, we basically just looked at the Rauch classification, and we showed that if you look at differentiated versus homogeneous products, then contract enforcement is much more important for heterogeneous products to solve this kind of contracting problem, right? So, so I think you could use the same split, and I think there have been some follow-up papers that have confirmed our results with better data. So I definitely think that even just looking at differentiated versus heterogeneous products based on the Rauch classification has worked in other papers, and it would be something that would be pretty easy to implement.
Yes. So in terms of forms of payment, yes, that's really important, very interesting to me. One problem, so one thing I think it's still relevant for the Chinese, especially these small Chinese private firm, is that I read it from the website is that the most common way to do the transaction is through the direct transfer. That is, they do not use like credits, letter of credit or other these advanced financial institutions because it's very costly. For these small firms, they usually pay like 30% down payment, and they pay the rest of the money after the importer receiving the bills of lading. That is the proof that the good is shipped. But that is the payment is made before they actually receive the good or examine the quality. And also for some, I think the electronic goods are very, very interesting to look at it because just like Dorian said, like the toast, you cannot observe the quality directly immediately after you receive the products. You need some testing. So the quality usually resolved after a few after some time. So I still think the mechanism here, the information problem is still like severe in the trade, especially for these complicated goods. And for the Rauch classification, maybe we can talk more details later because I look at that, but I found that most of the goods are classified as heterogeneous goods, which kind of lack of variance for me. So I hope I can get some like continuous index for the complication or continuous index for the difficulty detecting quality, something like that, other than 0 or 1 classification. So that's my thoughts on that. But we can definitely talk more privately on that classification.
Yeah, no, I think that would be interesting to document that because it's not typically what we see in other data sets in terms of payment structure. So the typical thing is to have open account, and open account typically has 30 to 90 days payment periods after delivery, which is exactly for the reason of quality. So in some sense, I can totally see that this may be different in China, but in some sense, it would be good to kind of discuss that that's a special feature, and also that would be an interesting contribution to that other literature.
Yes. So ideally, if I can observe the payment for these transactions, it will be perfect. If there's kind of that data set, I will be super interested to know. Yes.
Are there any data sets, I wonder, about complaints that have been made about products? Because I was kind of thinking, like, Duran's toaster is a good example of where it's delayed. It could be, I mean, I don't know, you might have had it for a year, right? And then it stopped working, but a really famous one was that sheetrock that was used in a lot of houses, and then all of a sudden, I can't remember what happened, but it was making everybody sick. And that would be an example where people would have been paid years before they realized the problem. But I wonder if there's some sort of like a register of complaints about products that you could get and kind of find out the examples of the ones where people really were unhappy about what they got in terms of the quality.
So I don't know whether this kind of massive data set exists, but one similar could be like the let me see. So kind of like the review, like the consumer's report, something like that. So just like advertising. So I and other courses, with other courses, starting to look at a specific product like the cell phone industry. So because we have like Chinese brands and other brands, and the Chinese brands are developing very fast. So maybe for a particular product like cars, like cell phones, we can look at the consumer reports, see whether there is complaints or not. But across products may be too hard to find.
But there might be something, a lot of the imports would be intermediate goods, and I wonder if there would be very, you know, like some company imports some switch and then it starts, they get lots of complaints from their consumers that switch keeps, which is part of their product, keeps going bad, and then that you would think that there would be some sort of collection of that information because it would be so important to the manufacturers using those intermediates if they're faulty.
Okay, maybe I should read more about like reports from industry association to see whether they have kind of reports. That would be another direction to see about this issue. But right now, up to my knowledge, I'm not quite sure about the data set, but I think that's a quite valuable direction to look at for this information problem, the quality issue. Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah,
yes.
So very, very nice paper, great presentation. I wasn't completely sure about it, some things about the model. You said that these low productivity firms are eventually kicked out of the market because of the shocks that they get.
Yes.
Does that process go on forever, so that like in the limit you only have the very best exporters, or is there like a non-degenerate steady state where you have like a fixed number, a fixed measure of good type or high type firms and low type firms? I was wondering whether you have an equilibrium or a steady state in this
yeah,
economy.
So here in the model, I only looking at the steady state. So there is a kind of a simplified assumption that is after the regulation, we arrive at a steady state immediately. So the bad firms kicked out immediately. So that is, in terms of steady state, the regulation is like one-time shock. Some firms decide not to enter, that's forever, one-time shock. But if you look at the exporter dynamic, over time, the bad firms are kicking out. So in low efficient firms, they're getting lucky at the beginning, so they can enter the market. But these inefficient firms over time, they cannot always be lucky to getting a low draw of cost. So they will be exiting market more easily. So there is, even in a steady state, there is exporter dynamics. Yes. So I just saw Walter's comment about paper on product recalls, and that's another possible data set which is posted publicly. So I think that's another direction to look at the recalls. Like after the recalls are posted, what happens to these exporters? But